19 stories. It's a long time to keep your eyes open, but once we start, you won't have a choice. You're settled in. Lights low. You feel safe. Remember that feeling, because by the end, the silence of your house will sound very different. We're going where the logic of the sun doesn't apply to the things waiting in the corners of your vision. Pull the blanket tighter. Adjust your headphones. 19 windows are open. Let's begin our first story.
Welcome to Halfway Dark.
The apartment that bent. The first night, the hallway seemed longer than it had during the day, stretching into shadowed corners that shouldn't exist, the walls subtly leaning toward me like patient observers. A soft tap echoed from the far end, yet the hallway hadn't changed. The sound traveled backwards, arriving before my ears registered the source. Impossible, but undeniable. The ceiling warped slightly, bending light so that corners dissolved into each other, creating an open space where a wall should have been. Something moved inside it. A masked figure crouched in the warped corner, tilting unnaturally, limbs folding in ways human bones shouldn't, observing me without breathing, yet I felt each inhale. Another figure appeared at the opposite end, impossibly tall, stretching through the ceiling, mask glinting faintly, reflecting angles that didn't exist, watching with intent that pierced the air. The floorboards groaned beneath invisible weight, but I felt it directly beneath my feet, pressing in a pattern that made the apartment vibrate subtly under my skin. The walls whispered faintly, a sound like fingers dragging along plaster, marking measurements I couldn't understand, twisting the space so it didn't align with memory. The balcony curtain shivered. A figure's head appeared, warped and elongated, mask drooping slightly, yet I felt its gaze inside, tracking my every hesitant movement. Footsteps echoed from multiple directions at once, though no one moved. The sound collided, overlapping, impossible to locate, bending my perception of distance and space. A hand pressed against the wall behind me. Its fingers stretched impossibly long, flexing along the plaster, brushing lightly as if memorizing the curves of the apartment. The ceiling above rippled, shifting slightly, revealing the faint outline of a masked intruder crawling along beams that should have been solid. The hallway outside bent unnaturally. Shadows stretched and folded into themselves, forming faces where no one stood, observing my hesitation, measuring my fear with exact precision. The balcony figure extended an arm impossibly through the curtain fabric, pressing against invisible glass, bending light and air around it like a physical distortion. Another figure emerged from the warped corner, mask featureless, head tilted too far, body unnaturally long, leaning into the room as if gravity were theirs alone to bend. The floorboards beneath the bedroom trembled, soft taps progressing in a sequence that matched my heartbeat, teaching it, mapping it, turning fear into rhythm. The walls warped subtly, stretching into shapes that shouldn't exist, angles bending, doorways appearing where they hadn't before, a liminal labyrinth forming around me. The masked figures aligned in the warped hallway, tilting in perfect unison, pressing hands lightly, bending the apartment space around them to trap my attention. A scraping came from above, faint but precise, moving along the warped beams, limbs stretching through walls as if mapping every invisible corner of the apartment. The balcony shadow shifted, appearing in multiple places at once, angles that should have been impossible folding the room into itself, bending the viewer's expectation of space. A faint whisper came from beneath the floorboards, syllables warped, twisting against the laws of sound, pressing into my skull with careful patience. The hallway stretched again. Each masked figure now moved in ways that defied gravity, stepping along walls, tilting sideways, crawling up ceilings, angles snapping violently, yet silently into new formations. The balcony figure's mask pressed through the curtain, bending into the room, elongated unnaturally, like a reflection of the impossible angles the apartment now forced. Ceiling beams twisted, floorboards shifted under invisible weight, shadows pressed inward, the air thickened, carrying the sound of distant, patient breathing from every impossible corner simultaneously. I stepped toward the warped hallway, and the figures synchronized, tilting, reaching impossibly long limbs, guiding me into the folds of space that shouldn't exist, each step measured and exact. The balcony shadow moved along the glass, bending itself through light and fabric, pressing against the room without entering, forcing my perception to distort with every shift. The walls pressed closer, folding space, bending the apartment around me. I realized the masked intruders were not confined by geometry. They controlled it, shaping perception like a living maze. The ceiling groaned, shadows rippled, floorboards whispered beneath my feet. Every step I took echoed in impossible directions, angles folding back, overlapping with echoes that didn't match reality. A final soft tap sounded across the warped hallway. The masked figures paused, perfectly still, pressing lightly against the walls, the apartment itself quivering as though holding its breath with them. The balcony curtain lifted slightly, revealing the elongated face of a mask bending space, pressing forward with impossible patience, waiting for me to move incorrectly. The shadows remained, leaning, tilting, stretching the apartment into shapes I couldn't remember, couldn't map, a liminal trap where walls, ceiling, and floor obeyed the intruder's will. When morning came, the apartment appeared normal. The shadows were gone, the walls straightened, the beams aligned. Yet the memory of angles that couldn't exist lingered, and I could feel the apartment listening still. The tenants who never left. The apartment was silent when I moved in, except for the faint hum of the old pipes. I didn't notice anything strange until the first night, when the air thickened without cause. A slow drag sounded from the ceiling above. I froze, listening as something moved along the beams, careful, patient, pressing weightlessly against the plaster. The light flickered, shadows folding unnaturally against the walls. A shape emerged from the hallway corner tall, thin, with a blank mask, standing still as if studying every inch of the room. Another figure appeared behind it, crouched low, limbs bent in ways that made my stomach twist. Their masks were smooth, featureless, but the air around them pulsed with intent. I tried to leave the room. The door trembled slightly, as if someone pressed from the other side, testing the lock's resistance. The handle shifted, cold and deliberate. A soft scratching came from the bedroom floorboards. Something moved beneath, tracing a path toward me with silent patience. My pulse raced as the room seemed to shrink around me. The masked figures shifted. They didn't move like humans, but like shadows that remembered what human motion should look like. Their heads tilted in unison, a silent communication I could not decipher. The ceiling groaned, then scraped along the beams again. I saw the faintest movement above, long, thin limbs bending, stepping without weight, a presence aware of every sound I made. I backed into the corner, feeling the pressure grow. The hallway outside seemed to lengthen, stretching impossibly, shadows pooling at the edges, reaching toward me in slow, impossible gestures. The figures leaned closer, their masks reflecting the faint light in distorted patterns. I could feel their attention, like a physical force pressing against my chest, steady and patient. A tap came from the balcony window. Light pressed through the curtain, revealing a third masked figure outside, arms pressed against the glass, leaning with a calm, horrifying deliberateness. The air around me thickened, carrying the scent of damp plaster and faint dust, like the building itself exhaled in sync with the intruder's movements. The shadows outside my door tilted, pressing against the frame in careful rhythm. I realized each movement was synchronized, almost choreographed, an intelligence behind their patience I could not comprehend. A faint, wet scraping sound came from the closet. I held my breath as a shape slid from the shadows, limbs folding perfectly, mask featureless, brushing against the floor like a predator learning space. The balcony figure pushed slightly through the curtain. The fabric clung to its face, bending unnaturally, revealing smooth, white contours that seemed to breathe faintly as it pressed closer. I could hear faint, dragging steps from the hallway beyond. They didn't belong to anyone human, yet the weight was exact, deliberate, moving closer with a patience that made the air vibrate. A tap-scrape-tap pattern came from the ceiling, slow, controlled. My ears strained as the sound traveled along the beams, calculating, pressing, testing, like invisible hands measuring my reactions. The figures leaned closer, tilting masks in perfect unison. Their bodies swayed, long and thin, bending without breaking, mapping the room, adjusting silently to every movement I made. The balcony figure withdrew, but the sense of being watched intensified. Shadows stretched from the window across the room, folding into corners, outlining figures too tall and precise to be human. The closet shifted again, scraping against itself. A hand or something that mimicked a hand pressed against the wall, tracing a line along the plaster with deliberate care, pausing as if waiting for acknowledgement. The hallway remained silent, but a soft pressure pressed against my apartment door. The wood creaked subtly, bending under invisible fingers, testing, calculating how easily it could yield. The masked figures leaned simultaneously toward the room, as if sensing my fear. Their masks tilted in perfect rhythm, the slightest hum emanating from them, pressing into the air like static. The ceiling scraped once more, slower this time, deliberate, moving closer to the center of the apartment. My pulse thundered, each beat echoing through the floors and walls. The balcony figure peeked again through the curtain, a fraction of a second, then withdrew, leaving the shadows behind it to stretch further across the walls in elongated shapes. The closet door creaked open slightly. Light from the hallway slipped in, reflecting on a mask tilted sideways, the edges faintly cracking as if stretching to see the world outside its domain. I backed toward the bed. The air pressed against my chest, as if the room itself leaned toward the masked figures, echoing their intent, aligning with their movements. A soft, deliberate tap sounded from the balcony railing, then a scrape along the wall, then a quiet shift from beneath the floorboards. Each sound measured, testing, waiting. The masked figures outside the door shifted one final time, tilting heads in unison, pressing hands lightly against the wood. I could feel the force through the frame, patient and knowing. The balcony shadow moved last, bending the curtain in one smooth motion, revealing the faint outline of a figure standing, watching, its posture unnerving, calm, impossible, waiting for me to move. The ceiling shifted slightly, then stopped. Silence thickened, almost suffocating. The room vibrated with potential energy, the masked figures holding still, waiting, a warning in every deliberate pause. When I dared to breathe, it echoed like a mistake. The air remained thick with intent, and even as dawn crept in, the apartment retained the memory of their weight, patient and unrelenting. The shadows that waited in my apartment. The first night, I noticed a subtle pressure in the air, like someone standing just behind the wall, shaping the silence around me. The apartment felt smaller immediately. A floorboard creaked softly in the hallway, deliberate, slow. I froze, staring at the dark corner by the door, where shadows pooled unnaturally, stretching toward me. I saw nothing when I turned on the lights, but the edges of the room rippled as if fabric in the walls shifted, hiding something patient. The curtains quivered without wind, brushing against the floor. For a moment, they formed vague shapes, limbs folding and unfolding in the half-light, like waiting human forms. A soft tap came from the balcony window. I swore it came from just beyond the glass, fingertips tracing the cold surface, marking it with invisible patterns. I backed toward the bedroom, heartbeat in my ears. The air grew thick, scented faintly with damp rubber and dust. Something was moving deliberately across the floor. The doorknob of the hallway clicked twice. Not enough to turn, just enough to announce presence. I could feel it press lightly, testing how much weight it could bear. The floorboards shifted near the kitchen. A shadow glided across the wall, tall and featureless, its head tilting unnaturally, scanning me as if memorizing my shape. A second shadow appeared behind the first, crouched low, limbs bent at impossible angles. Both stood silently, waiting, exhaling air I couldn't feel, but that chilled the room. I backed against the bedroom wall. The first shadow raised a hand, long and narrow, fingers brushing the carpet slowly, shaping pressure that pressed into my feet. The balcony curtains shifted again, revealing a faceless figure outside, its posture perfect, watching silently. Light reflected off its mask, revealing subtle imperfections, as though handcrafted to unsettle. Soft scratches came from the ceiling. Something crawled across the beams above me, careful, deliberate, moving toward a spot where it could observe without being seen. The shadows in the hallway shifted closer, stretching, almost walking along walls in ways that defied human movement. I could feel them watching every twitch of my body. A faint scraping sound traced along the baseboard. Something long and thin slipped against the wall, brushing against furniture as if marking territory, unseen but present. The balcony figure pressed closer, peeking through the curtain slit. Its presence bent the fabric unnaturally, casting shadows that formed shapes vaguely human, but wrong, elongated, impossible. I tried to close my eyes. The pressure in the room intensified, like fingers pressing lightly against my temples, molding the air around me, tracing the edges of my fear. The shadows outside the door leaned forward slightly, tilting, adjusting, synchronized. Their weight pressed into the apartment through the door, as if the wood were transparent to them. The ceiling scraping moved toward the bedroom door. I could hear slow, deliberate breaths, wet and soft, filling the thin spaces in the air where sound shouldn't exist. The shadow by the hallway pressed a hand against the wall, leaving a faint smudge. Its mask reflected dim light, featureless yet somehow knowing, observing every inch of the room. The balcony figure pushed through the curtain an inch, stretching impossibly to peer inside. I could see the hollow shape of its mask pressing against fabric, bending reality subtly. I froze as a tiny click sounded behind the bed. Something slid along the floor beneath it, moving closer, brushing my shoes lightly with inhuman patience. The shadows at the door adjusted again. They moved with precision, tilting heads, stretching limbs. Even the air seemed to bend around them as they studied me. The balcony curtains quivered violently. I swore I saw two more figures step onto the railing outside, masks pale and blank, watching the interior as if rehearsing entry. A subtle scrape came from the kitchen. Long fingers traced the counter edge, moving slowly, brushing items without toppling anything, mapping the space, learning the room's dimensions. I held my breath. The shadows outside shifted slightly, coordinating movement. Something was aligning, preparing, waiting for a cue. I didn't understand. The scraping from the ceiling stopped. Silence fell, thick, oppressive. I could hear my own heartbeat in the room, loud against the absence of sound. Then the balcony curtains pulled slightly inward again. A figure outside leaned down to peer closer, mask pressing through, reflecting the room back at me in distorted form. The two shadows by the door moved closer, tilting as they approached without sound. I could feel pressure through the wood, faint but firm, like a gentle hand against a chest. A low, rhythmic tap came from the window behind me. 3 times, slow, steady. Each tap echoed, marking seconds I wished didn't exist. The shadows at the door adjusted one final time, synchronized perfectly, tilting toward the apartment. Their hands pressed against the wood lightly, a whispering of movement I couldn't see. The balcony figure withdrew slightly, disappearing from view, but I could sense it lingering, waiting, patient, like something that knew I'd remain awake until morning. The ceiling gave one final creak, a long, slow exhale through the beams. The apartment held its breath as the pressure of unseen bodies remained, quietly testing my resolve. When daylight arrived, the shadows were gone. The apartment felt empty, but the air remained thick, carrying the memory of presence, a warning that the quiet things never really leave. The ones who stood in the doorways. The quietest nights in my building were the ones where the power flickered and stayed dim, leaving the hallways washed in that strange amber glow that made everything look older than it was. I had lived here long enough to know which creaks belonged to the building and which didn't. The ones tonight felt deliberate, too slow and too soft to be settling wood. The hallway outside my apartment stretched longer than usual, the edges fading into shadow as if the lights were pulling back from something moving in the distance. I heard a faint scrape, the sound of fabric brushing drywall, followed by a soft shuffle that stopped directly in front of my door, pausing like someone deciding their next step. A peephole showed nothing at first, just the hallway darkened to a deep orange. Then something shifted near the floor, rising slowly as though a crouched figure stood up. A person stood outside, wearing a plain, hand-cut paper mask with uneven eye holes. The mask drooped slightly, dampened by something that made it sink and cling to their face. They didn't move. They just stood there with their head tilted slightly, listening to the tiny sounds inside my apartment as if mapping where I stood, how I breathed. I stepped back and their head followed the motion, tracking perfectly through the peephole, the eye holes revealing only darkness behind the paper. No glint of eyes at all. Another faint shuffle sounded from down the hall, and a second masked figure stepped into view, wearing a mask drawn crudely with charcoal smears, suggesting a smile that didn't curve naturally. They stopped in the exact center of the hallway, facing my door, feet together, arms hanging loosely as though waiting for a signal to move closer. The lights flickered once, and when they came back, a third figure stood nearer than the other two, mask painted with crude streaks, forming shapes I couldn't decipher. All three stood at differing distances, forming a silent, perfect triangle around my apartment door, each mask aimed at the peephole like they knew exactly where to look. I backed further into my apartment, the floor cold under my feet. The hallway became faintly audible through the door, soft breaths aligning as if they inhaled at the same moment. A faint tap sounded near the bottom of the door, too low for any hand to comfortably reach unless someone knelt. The tap repeated 3 times, evenly spaced, disturbingly polite. The masked figure closest to the door leaned slightly forward, and the paper mask wrinkled where a mouth should be, folding in on itself as though something behind it pressed outward. I checked the chain lock out of instinct. It trembled slightly, vibrating as though the door absorbed some quiet pressure pushing gently against it from the other side. A soft drag sounded above me, and I realized the sound came from the ceiling, something moving slowly across the plaster toward the center of the room with careful, crawling steps. The ceiling dust shifted, falling in faint lines as if fingers traced along the beams overhead. Each slow movement matched the breaths outside, syncing unintentionally with a rhythm I didn't want to understand. The hallway grew extremely quiet. Then the masked figures began softly shifting their weight side to side, not stepping, just changing balance, like they were preparing their bodies for motion. The ceiling movement stopped directly above me. The air tightened, stretching thin, the silence pressing against my ears, until I heard my own heartbeat echoing far too loud. The door creaked inward a fraction, despite the lock still holding. The wood strained, bowing inward half an inch, as though something leaned against it with a steady, patient pressure. A whisper-thin strip of light formed under the door as the masked figure crouched again, placing its face against the floor, so close that I could see the distorted outline through the gap. The paper mask breathed. The edges fluttered with each slow inhale, the wetness darkening the paper until it clung tight, revealing the uneven shape of the face beneath it. Another tap sounded behind me, against the balcony door this time, the glass vibrating gently. I turned and saw a silhouette standing on the other side of the curtains, unmoving. The curtains trembled as though someone traced a finger down the length of the fabric, revealing the faint outline of a mask drawn with black shapes where features should be. The apartment walls felt thinner, sound traveling strangely through them. I heard footsteps above, below, and beside me, perfectly synchronized, approaching the center of the room from all directions. The masked figure outside the front door straightened slowly. Something sharp pressed lightly against the wood, scraping downward in a controlled line that left behind a shallow groove. The balcony door rattled softly, and the silhouette leaned closer, mask nearly pressing through the curtain as the fabric molded to its features with the shifting windless air. The light dimmed again, flickering low enough that the entire apartment pulsed, shadows stretching momentarily into thin, reaching shapes that slid along the walls. When the lights returned, the masked figures outside the door had shifted positions. Now all three stood directly in front of it, faces almost touching the wood, masks brushing as they breathed. The scratching from the ceiling resumed, but this time moving downward, settling inside the walls with slow, methodical steps that traveled toward the back of the apartment. The balcony curtain pressed inward slightly, a clear outline of a hand forming against the glass beneath the fabric, fingers splayed too wide and too long to be comfortable. I stepped toward the kitchen and froze when something tapped softly from inside the cabinets, as if someone crouched beneath the sink, drummed their fingers against the door. The masked figures outside stopped breathing in unison, holding a single long inhale. They pressed into the apartment through the thin door, weighing down the air until it tasted metallic. The balcony curtain slowly parted 3 inches, though no wind entered. A thin slice of the outside figure's mask appeared, painted with thick black strokes, forming a set of false teeth. The ceiling steps reached the hallway closet and stopped abruptly. The door handle twitched once and turned slowly, as though tested by a hand lacking the strength to fully open it. The apartment felt too full, the air disturbed by unseen presence's shifting weight. Every surface seemed to listen, leaning inward like the building itself understood what waited outside. The 3 masked figures at the front door leaned back simultaneously, adjusting their posture as though preparing for movement, heads tilting slightly to one side in perfect synchronization. The balcony figure lifted a hand and traced a line down the curtain again, pressing harder this time until the fabric split slightly, revealing the gleam of glass behind it. The scratching inside the closet stopped, replaced by silence so absolute it rang. Then a slow, deliberate knock sounded from inside the door, positioned exactly where my forehead would be. When the lights flickered once more, the apartment briefly fell into total darkness, and in that brief moment, every doorway in the room felt occupied by someone standing silently just out of view. The mirror where their faces waited. I kept the old hallway mirror covered for years after my mother's warning, a faded sheet hanging like dead skin over the glass, even though I never fully believed her stories about what lived inside it. The sheet fluttered some nights when the air was still, moving as if someone behind it drew a slow breath. I always forced myself to ignore it and walk faster down the hall. Last week, I heard a faint tapping from the mirror frame, soft and deliberate, like knuckles knocking from inside the glass. Each knock spaced evenly, patient and impossibly calm. The sheet shifted again, this time lifting just an inch, as though a hand pressed upward from beneath. I froze, listening to a whisper of fabric sliding over something smooth. That night I woke to find the sheet folded neatly on the floor, placed with careful precision. The mirror stood bare for the first time in years, its surface darker than the hallway around it. My reflection wasn't there. Only the hallway behind me showed, empty and stretched too long, as if the mirror revealed a version of my home that had forgotten its real shape. The air thickened and something moved deep within the glass, a shadow shifting like a figure pacing slowly in the far distance of the mirrored world, just out of focus. I leaned closer, trying to see if it was only my imagination. A face appeared suddenly behind the glass, impossibly close, wearing a featureless white mask with tiny fracture lines around the edges. The masked figure didn't mimic my posture or movements. It watched independently, head tilting sideways in a slow, unnatural motion that made the fractures pulse like veins. A second masked face slid up from the bottom of the frame, rising as though climbing a ladder beneath the world inside the mirror. Its mask was smooth and wet-looking, like polished bone. Both figures lifted their hands at the same time, pressing their palms against the other side of the glass. The surface stretched inward slightly, as though softening under their touch. The mirror trembled with a low hum, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. Dust drifted down from the ceiling in tiny spirals, responding to a force I couldn't see. Their fingers pressed harder until the glass bowed inward, forming silhouettes of their hands reaching into my reality. The room felt colder, sinking gradually into a darker temperature. A hairline crack formed in the top corner of the mirror, thin as a strand of silk, but glowing faintly with a pale color that didn't belong to any light I recognized. The two masked figures stepped back into the darkness, making room for something larger moving behind them. A shape too tall to fit in my hallway leaned forward from the mirrored void. Its mask was long and narrow, curving slightly like a stretched face molded by someone who had forgotten what humans look like. The surface rippled gently with quiet breathing. The creature's hand reached out, slipping through the softened glass with no resistance, fingers unfolding longer than necessary, joints bending too loosely as though newly learned. Its fingertips grazed the wall beside the mirror, leaving faint smudges the color of old ash. The hallway dimmed, absorbing the marks as if the house recognized them. Two smaller masked figures crawled through next, limbs moving silently across the hardwood with a fluid grace that made them feel more like shadows pretending to be bodies. They circled me slowly, not close enough to touch, just close enough that I could hear the faint rasp of their masks brushing the air, an imitation of breathing they did not need. The tall figure extended its hand toward my chest. The mask shifted subtly, forming shallow impressions of my facial features, like clay being molded by invisible fingers from behind the surface. I felt pressure inside my own face, as if something pulled a faint copy of me outward. My reflection flickered inside the mirror, appearing briefly before disappearing again. Behind the glass, the mirrored hallway grew brighter, revealing dozens of other masked figures standing in rows like waiting passengers, each mask shaped into echoes of unfamiliar human faces. The tall figure leaned closer to me, mask pulsing gently, and the mirror strained like stretched skin, ready to tear open. The floor vibrated with each pulse, syncing with my heartbeat. The smaller masked figures placed their hands lightly on my shoulders without weight or warmth, guiding me forward a single step toward the trembling mirror surface. The sheet that once covered the mirror stirred on the floor as though something beneath it exhaled. The fabric rose slightly, then collapsed, flattening as if satisfied. My breath fogged the air, though the house wasn't cold enough for that. The fog drifted toward the mirror, outlining the faintly shimmering doorway forming in the center. The tall figure stepped halfway through, its mask splitting down the center like a hidden hinge opening, just enough to reveal darkness inside, shifting like something thinking. I tried to step back, but the smaller figures held me lightly. Not forcefully, just insistently enough that moving backward felt like pushing against deep water. The mirror brightened again, showing a hallway very much like mine, but subtly wrong. The doors too narrow, the angles too sharp, shadows falling upward instead of down, In that mirrored hallway, a version of myself stood motionless, wearing a mask shaped exactly like my face, but smoother, more perfect, as though carved from memory rather than flesh. The masked version of me lifted its hand and beckoned once, palm rising in a slow, fluid movement. The tall figure responded by placing its elongated hand gently against my back. The mirror flickered and pulsed, pulling lightly, creating a pressure behind my ribs, as though the air itself was trying to guide me through the doorway into the waiting mirrored world. The masked version of me stepped closer from within the glass, its movements perfectly timed with mine, copying not my actions but my breath, inhaling when I inhaled, exhaling when I exhaled. The tall figure wrapped its long fingers around the edges of the mirror frame, widening the opening as cracks spread outward like branching lightning across the glass. The hallway lights dimmed completely, leaving the mirror as the only source of illumination, its glow soft and strangely warm, despite the cold shapes emerging through it. The smaller figures leaned close to my ears, masks touching my skin with the chilling smoothness of stone, and the mirror whispered with a sound like distant footsteps approaching fast. The last thing I saw before the mirror swallowed its glow was my masked reflection lifting its hand again, this time tapping gently on the inside of the glass, waiting for me to finish coming through. The quiet things that moved at night. I first noticed the movement in my room when the air turned heavy enough that my breath came back to me warm, as if someone else exhaled right beside my cheek in the darkness. The floorboards shifted just once, softly, like a careful. I lay still, pretending to sleep, feeling the mattress dip under me from pressure that wasn't mine. Something brushed the side of the blanket, a slow dragging fingertip, deliberate, curious, testing the edge of the fabric, the way a stranger might test the edge of a page. I kept my breathing even while the faintest creak sounded from under the bed, followed by a small thud. I knew wasn't the house settling because it paused, as if listening back. I smelled dust and something like wet plaster, the strange scent of old walls torn. The faint tap of masked plastic touched the edge of the box spring, like someone adjusting their face. A subtle scrape traveled along the underside of the mattress, tracing the outline of my body. Each inch matched me perfectly, like fingers memorizing the map of where I lay. A soft shifting sound came from the far corner of the room, as though fabric brushed the wall. Something was standing there, waiting, the way a person waits for a cue they already know. I tried opening my eyes just a sliver. A pale shape hovered near my desk, tall and quiet, wearing a mask too smooth to be human. No features, just a blank oval. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging me. Then the shape under the bed shifted again. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across. They dripped up the wall instead of down, like darkness learning a new direction. The blank masked figure raised one hand and tapped its finger continuously again. Each tap echoed faintly, as though there were more behind it. The thing beneath the bed mirrored the tapping rhythm, knocking against the floor in perfect synchrony. The room felt like a metronome guided by something dead and patient. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft clicking of teeth or something imitating teeth. It came from the closet door, which was slightly open, though I never left it that way. A second masked face slowly emerged from the gap, sideways, as if sliding down a wall rather than stepping out. The mask was cracked down the center, but the crack pulsed faintly. The one in the closet began tilting its head at sharp angles, testing how far it could move without breaking the bones it no longer had. Each tilt released a soft popping sound. The blank masked figure by the desk stepped backward without bending its legs, gliding soundlessly until its back pressed flat against. Another presence crawled from beneath the bed, long limbs folding out one by one. Its mask had no eye holes, only a smooth reflect. I stayed frozen as all three turned their masks toward me in perfect unison. Something behind the reflective mask shifted, pressing outward as if curious to see more of me. The cracked masked figure reached out and touched the floor. Its fingers elongated like wet clay, stretching toward my ankle with slow, certain intention, never once shaking or hesitating. The air pulsed once, almost like a heartbeat passing. The walls seemed to tighten, pulling closer, as though the house itself was holding its breath with me. The figures moved again, switching positions without footsteps or sound, like frames skipping in a broken film. One moment they were across the room, the next they were inches away, cold fingertips pressed lightly against my forehead through the blanket. They traced downward, stopping over my mouth as though rehearsing the shape of silence on my lips. I could feel the texture of the mask hovering inches from my face, smooth, cold, almost damp. It breathed without moving, a quiet inhaling sound that came from nowhere visible. The cracked masked figure leaned close, the fissure widening slightly as though smiling. Something inside that crack whispered against itself, forming sounds that didn't belong to language. The reflective masked figure lifted its head toward the ceiling, and suddenly the ceiling itself shimmered like water, showing glimpses of a night sky that wasn't ours. Something hovered above the surface of that impossible sky, watching, its reflection appearing on the mask like an invitation or a warning. The figure beneath me lightly tapped the bed frame. The tapping spread through the floorboards, traveling down the hallways of the house like a signal. I could hear faint replies coming from deeper within the walls, moving closer. The room darkened around the edges as if shadow bled inward. My heartbeat cinched with the tapping, despite my attempts to control it, matching their rhythm without permission. I felt the blanket slowly being peeled back from my chest, lifted by invisible hands so gentle they might have been polite. The three masked figures watched without blinking. A cold rush of air pressed against my skin as if the room swallowed warmth. The reflective masked figure touched my shoulder. The crack in the second mask spread wider until something inside looked out. Not eyes, just a shape learning how to observe. It studied me with stillness more terrifying than rage. The floor beneath the bed rumbled softly, and a whisper emerged, not from the masked beings, but from the wood itself, speaking the same rhythm the tapping had carved into me. The three figures leaned closer in a slow, synchronized motion. The room pulsed again, bending, reshaping itself around them, like the house had been waiting for their return. The mask inches from my face changed shape slightly, the smooth surface shifting like fluid. It began imprinting my features into its blank canvas, pressing them outward in faint dale. My room felt smaller by the second, walls inching inward as if eager to meet the masked things halfway. The rhythm returned, slow and patient, calling for an ending I was not ready for. The last thing I saw before the blankets tightened around me was all three masks vibrating gently, reshaping themselves, molding to resemble my face as closely as possible. Then the lights inside the cracks glowed faintly, and the house whispered welcome in a voice that did not come from any human throat I recognized, soft and hungry in the darkness. The animal-masked people who kept changing into things that weren't animals. I first noticed the fox mask in my hallway mirror, even though no one stood there. Just the reflection-tall figure, two narrow shoulders, bright animal eyes staring back at me. When I stepped closer, the reflection didn't mimic me. It tilted its head in the opposite direction, body swaying gently, like it was adjusting to a form it wasn't used to. I turned around. Nothing behind me, but the mirror figure leaned closer, pressing its mask against the glass, fabric stretching in strange pulses as if breathing through damp cloth. The fox mask shifted. The snout elongated, then folded inward, then widened again, glitching shapes like clay pulled by invisible hands struggling to choose an identity. I reached out. The mirror fogged around my fingertips, forming a sharp outline of a deer mask behind the fox mask, overlapping, merging like two faces trapped in one skull. The figure stepped forward in the reflection, only in the reflection. The carpet behind me didn't move. yet the mirrored feet sank into phantom fibers that weren't there. I stepped back. The figure grew taller, mask widening, seams stretching across the snout, as if something inside pushed against the fabric, trying to break through. Another mask formed behind it, an owl's beak pressing out through the fox's cheek, feathers stitched into the deer's jaw, multiple features merging like a single evolving creature. The reflection flickered. 3 figures now: fox, deer, owl, wearing masks, all sharing the same body, heads overlapping, trying to claim the face like predators fighting for dominance. Their body in the reflection bent sideways, limbs twisting like rubber, stretching until the joints clicked into new angles that made my spine ache just looking at them. The fox face pushed forward, swallowing the deer face momentarily, mask smoothing over, then tearing open again, as the owl eyes forced their way through the fabric. I flicked on the hallway light. The entire reflection froze, masks rotating slowly toward me, as though the light activated something ancient in their stitched expressions. The bodies began to crawl upward, gliding up the mirror's surface like gravity had reversed, moving until their masks stared down at me from the ceiling of the reflection. Then the mirror bulged outward. The glass didn't crack, it stretched, warping forward like warm plastic, forming a convex dome with the 3 faces pressed against it. Their masks merged into an abomination of features, antlers piercing through feathered brows, snouts branching into beaks, teeth forming in places teeth shouldn't grow. A 4th face began to press from behind, larger, darker, mask unfinished, cloth wrinkling with each breath, like it wasn't sure what animal it was supposed to be. The glass trembled. The surface rippled, and the figure's hands pressed through just the hands. Pale, jointed wrong, fingers bending like wet paper forced into shapes. The hands tapped the mirror frame rhythmically, as if learning the size of the doorway they intended to climb through. Tap, tap, memorizing the limits. One hand pushed farther, slipping halfway out before snapping back like something yanked it violently back into the mirror world, protesting with a silent shudder. The 3 masks stared at me with new expressions, recognition maybe, or hunger, or the kind of knowing reserved for things older than memory. The reflection of my hallway behind them began to change. The carpet turned into a dense furred surface, shifting like the back of a sleeping animal, rising gently with every breath. The walls grew uneven, forming shapes that resembled ribs pushing outward from beneath the paint, like I was staring at the inside of something pretending to be a house. The largest mask pressed its face near mine, only the mirror separating us. Its snout widened, swallowing the smaller masks into its surface, devouring them quietly. The reflection's mouth stretched open. No teeth, just threads, strings, strands of mask fabric curling forward like tongues, tasting the border between worlds. I stepped back again. The figure stepped forward in perfect sync this time, matching me exactly, no longer trying to hide its intention to imitate. The hallway lights flickered. In the reflection, the lights were gone entirely, replaced by long shadows shaped like crawling animals, dragging themselves along a floor made of fur. The figure reached a hand fully out of the mirror. The skin was too smooth, too reflective, like polished clay warmed by breath and shaped by unseen artists. It whispered without a mouth, a shuffling sound like cloth dragged across skin, urging me closer with a plea I couldn't translate, but felt in my spine. The mirror glass cracked, not from impact, but from pressure behind it. The fissures bent outward, forming rib-like fractures that mimicked the warped hallway behind the creature. The hand retreated suddenly. The masks pulled back. The glass retracted into its original shape, as if inhaling deeply, pulling the nightmare back with it. The hallway reflection returned to normal. My face stared back, but my eyes in the reflection were wrong, too wide, too bright, too animal. I blinked. The reflection didn't. The masked people who stood in my doorways but never walked in. I first noticed the figure in my bedroom doorway when I turned off the light. A tall silhouette wearing a crooked deer mask, antlers bent like softened bone, standing perfectly still. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply existed in the frame of the doorway, like it had always belonged there, its edges too sharp for shadow. When I turned the light back on, it was gone instantly. No fading, no stepping away. Just gone, like someone unplugged it from reality without warning. The next night, a different masked figure appeared in my kitchen doorway. A fox mask, elongated jaw, carved wooden teeth, head tilted sharply as if mid-sentence before I interrupted. It didn't enter, didn't speak, just watched from the threshold, as though stepping inside would break a rule older than the house itself. I tried to approach. The figure flinched slightly, mask twisting sideways like a marionette tugged too hard. But it stayed within the doorway, refusing to cross the frame. I shut my eyes for a second. When I opened them again, it was gone, leaving the doorway oddly brighter, like something had drained out of the shadows. I started checking every doorway in the house at night. Each one felt colder than the last, as though something waited just out of sight, warming the threshold with its presence. The bathroom doorway revealed an owl mask hovering just low enough that its hollow eyes matched mine. It swayed gently, synchronized with my breathing, like it copied each inhale. I whispered, "What do you want?" The owl mask snapped upward an inch, acknowledging the question but not answering, then froze again, head angled like a bird listening for prey. I tested a theory. I stepped into the doorway with it. Instantly, the mask retreated, sliding backward into the bathroom, like a film rewinding, vanishing beyond the frame. I realized they didn't stalk me. They stalked the thresholds themselves, the spaces between rooms, the borders, the liminal parts of the house no one thinks about. I taped every doorway with blue painter's tape, hoping to catch movement. That night, every strip lay on the floor, cut perfectly down the center, as if sliced by a razor. The figures returned. 3 of them, deer, owl, fox, standing each in a different doorway, their masks angled toward me like they'd been discussing something before I entered. They never crossed inside, but their masks sharpened. Details that weren't there before had formed extra stitching, darker eye hollows, teeth carved deeper like they had grown. I noticed something else. They all leaned ever so slightly forward, as if the doorway itself was pushing them out, keeping them from spilling into the room. The house groaned quietly, not unsettling more like a warning. A boundary being tested, stretched, negotiated between the house and the masked things. One of them pressed a hand against the frame. The wood cracked slightly under the touch, splintering a thin line downward like a fracture racing through bone. I backed away. The deer mask rotated in a slow, unnatural turn, antlers scraping the top of the frame without bending, sparks flickering from the contact. The masked figures remained still as statues, but something behind them shifted darker shapes, moving deeper in the rooms they guarded, never approaching the doorway's edge. As I stared, the fox mask widened its jaw, not open-widened. The sides pulled outward like soft clay, stretching into a grin too broad for its shape. The owl mask blinked. Not eyelids, its entire mask flexed inward for a second, folding like fabric before snapping back to rigid wood. The deer mask stepped forward, half an inch, just enough for the threshold to creak, the frame tremble, the boundary shiver like it was struggling to hold them back. The house groaned louder, beams trembling overhead. The masked things leaned in unison, testing the frame's strength, their presence pressing against the invisible rule preventing entry. A crack shot across the top of the doorway, splinters dropping like teeth. The masked figures froze again, waiting, listening, deciding. Something whispered behind them. A chorus of soft, muffled voices, speaking words that weren't language, more like breath, passing through cloth masks worn for too long. The figures slowly retreated deeper into the rooms, their masks paling into shadow until only the faint outlines remained, then faded entirely like they stepped sideways into nothing. The house released a deep, hollow exhale. The cracks sealed. The door frames brightened. The room warmed by a few degrees. But now, every doorway feels wrong, too tall, too wide, too empty. Like something stretched them when I wasn't looking, creating just enough space for whatever comes next. And tonight, as I write this, I swear I see antlers slowly rising into view from the darkness of the hallway, waiting for me to notice. The masked things that crawled out of my mattress. I woke up because my mattress felt heavier, like someone was pressing down from inside it. Not above it, inside it, right beneath my spine, shifting slowly like breathing. I rolled off the bed. The sheet puffed upward, then sank, like something adjusting its weight beneath the fabric, settling into a shape that wasn't mine. A small bulge moved across the mattress, slow and deliberate, tracing the outline of a crawling figure no bigger than a toddler, limbs dragging in slow motion. The bulge paused near the pillows. Then a second bulge appeared beside it, and a third, all of them crawling under the sheet like pale insects preparing to emerge. The sheet rose slightly. Something inside pushed upward, testing the fabric, almost as if checking how thin the barrier was between them and the room. The first shape pressed its head up, stretching the sheet into a pointed mask, an unnatural fox-like snout forming beneath the cotton, breathing shallowly. The second shape copied the motion perfectly, stretching into a crude owl mask, wide and unmoving, the sheet pulled tight against its face like a second skin. I stepped back. The first mask began dragging itself upward, sliding toward the edge of the bed, still completely beneath the sheet, forming feature by feature in slow motion. The edge of the mattress dipped as the shape slipped downward, still hidden under the sheet, crawling off the bed and onto the floor without exposing a single limb. A tiny hand finally poked out from under the sheet-thin, gray, jointed wrong, fingers bending in too many places, followed by a crude rabbit mask stitched from the inside lining. Another figure slid out, owl-shaped, cloth stretching like skin, hollow eye shapes present, yet filled with nothing. Its head tilted violently sideways, as if testing its own neck. More lumps moved inside the mattress, shifting upward, crawling, pressing. The mattress bulged as if filled with dozens of tiny forms climbing toward escape. One slipped out through the stitching along the side, peeling it open like a mouth. Its mask was unfinished, half-wrinkled, lopsided, still shaping itself around its skull. They crawled silently. No footsteps, no breathing sounds, just the soft drag of limbs across carpet, synchronizing perfectly, like they practiced this moment for years. One climbed the knitstand. Its mask tightened with each movement, fabric contracting like muscle, forming an animal shape I couldn't identify. Too many ears and not enough jaw. Another figure crawled backward across the ceiling, limbs bending wrong, hips twisting 180 degrees, yet its mask always facing me with perfect stillness. They surrounded the bed, tapping at the mattress, as if asking it to open wider. The mattress responded with a low groan, sinking like wet soil. A much larger bulge rose in the center, slow, deliberate, heavy, pushing the mattress upward, as though something massive was about to tear through the fabric. The smaller masks gathered around it, kneeling, tilting their heads in unison, waiting with a silent reverence I felt deep in my stomach. The mattress tore slightly at the center. A long, pale limb slid out too thin to support its size, bending like rope, fingers scraping the fabric as it searched the air. Then the second limb. Then the mask, far larger than expected, shoved upward through the torn seam, a stitched hybrid of every animal face the smaller ones wore. It looked down at them like a parent inspecting its children, then turned its unfinished mask toward me, deep hollow fabric eyes widening without stretching. The smaller figures scattered, crawling up the walls, ceiling, under furniture, positioning themselves around me in a perfect uneven circle, each one tilting their heads the same degree. The larger figure pulled itself fully out of the mattress, dragging half the stuffing with it like entrails, its limbs folding into place with a sick, deliberate purpose. It approached without walking, gliding, pulled by its own mask, feet dragging lightly across the carpet as if guided by invisible strings. The smaller ones held the circle, preventing me from moving backward, their masks tightening, forming new details with every subtle shift of my breath. The large figure leaned close enough for the cloth of its mask to brush my face. It smelled like warm dust and something older soil from a grave never marked. It paused, tilted, observed, judging my reaction like a teacher disappointed in a student who arrived unprepared. Then all of them began crawling back into the mattress, at once sliding beneath it, merging into its fabric, pulling the torn seam closed as they disappeared. The mattress flattened, the room stilled. Only the faint impression of their masks remained on the sheets, slowly fading like dew evaporating in sunlight. The mattress sighed softly, as though settling back to sleep, waiting for me to lie down again. The hallway that moves when I sleep. I woke to a faint creak in the hallway outside my bedroom. The house smelled older, heavier, like the air had collected decades of silence. The hallway seemed longer than it should be. I counted the doors, but there were more than yesterday some I didn't remember existing. When I stepped toward the bathroom, the floor shifted beneath me, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the house itself was breathing along with my footsteps. The walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, with shadows sliding upward and pooling near corners that should have been empty. I reached for the light switch. The hallway stretched further back when I did, doors appearing in impossible alignment, just out of logical reach. I realized the mirror at the end reflected a hallway that wasn't mine, longer, darker, with more doors and faint silhouettes moving inside. One door creaked open. A shadow peeked out, too tall, too thin, head cocked unnaturally, staring in a way that made me feel seen before I arrived. I tried walking toward it, but the floor elongated, the ceiling lowered, walls twisting, forcing me to step sideways to stay upright. A faint whisper followed me, almost too soft to catch, saying my name in a tone older than the house itself. I turned my head. The silhouette had disappeared, but the shadow remained, detached from the door, hovering slightly above the floor, like it floated just beyond physics. I backed away, counting doors. Each one was subtly different, some wider, some darker, some reflecting shapes in their wood that weren't me. The hallway bent downward slightly, an impossible angle, and I could hear faint footsteps pacing the hallway behind me, yet I was alone. I tried leaving the house, but every exit led back into the same hallway, each door opening into new spaces I didn't recognize. The wallpaper shifted subtly when I looked away, the patterns rearranging themselves into twisted faces with mouths slightly open, silently whispering secrets I didn't understand. A soft metallic scrape echoed from the ceiling, moving with perfect rhythm along the hall, as if following an unseen line I couldn't perceive. When I leaned on the wall for support, it rippled slightly, pressing back against me, like the house wanted to keep me upright or trapped. I heard laughter, soft, deliberate, alien, coming from the far end, though no one should have been there, and the echo carried strangely, bending around corners that didn't exist. One door opened in front of me. Inside, a hallway stretched backward, mirrored perfectly, yet impossible, because it led deeper into the same house. I stepped inside. My footsteps matched mine exactly, but a faint second set echoed slightly behind, a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. The walls started whispering faintly, in syllables I could not understand, but felt crawling over my skin, following the rhythm of my pulse. I froze. The ceiling leaned closer. Shapes formed in the shadows, Tall, thin figures with faceless heads, moving in perfect alignment, mirroring my hesitation. I tried to run. The doors behind me stretched further as I approached, like a living corridor adjusting to keep me inside. One shadow detached from the wall, sliding silently toward me, a long, faceless silhouette that hovered inches above the warped floor. I backed into a corner. My reflection appeared in a mirror. I didn't remember hanging only. It wasn't my reflection. It was slightly wrong, smiling faintly before I moved. The ceiling pulses quickened, walls bending, floors rising slightly, all synchronized with a faint, invisible clock, counting me down like a predator testing patience. I noticed another door appear above the ceiling, no stairs, no ladder, just a black rectangle floating slightly off angle, beckoning, impossible to ignore. A whisper echoed, "Come upstairs. We've been waiting." The sound carried from the ceiling, but felt inside my head, curling around my thoughts. I froze. Shadows moved along the walls in perfect unison, aligning toward the floating doorway, stretching impossibly, as if the hallway itself was leading me somewhere. I turned toward the door I had come from. It had disappeared, replaced by more hallways, more doors, more shadows leaning toward me in silent, patient observation. The walls stretched and contracted like lungs, the ceiling breathing in rhythm at the pulses I felt under my feet, dragging time, dragging me into anticipation. I realized the hallway wasn't a place. It was alive, learning me, shaping itself to my fears, observing me, recording every choice, every heartbeat, every hesitation. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was waiting. The shadows were waiting. The hallway was waiting. And I knew it would never let me leave. The clock inside my house is learning to hurt me. The first night it started, the grandfather clock in my living room struck 13 times, though it had never done so before. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Each chime rang hollow, vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls, through my chest. I felt it in my teeth, in my gut, like something inside me was shifting. I touched the pendulum. It moved too quickly, swinging with a speed that should have snapped the mechanism in half. But it didn't. It was alive. I heard whispering behind the clock, low syllables in a tongue I didn't know, bending into my name, bending into my fear, bending into the house itself. The next night the chimes counted not hours, but moments, striking unpredictably, dragging minutes into seconds, seconds into a long drawn-out eternity I couldn't measure. I tried leaving, but the front door wouldn't latch. The handle twisted in my hand, warm, pulsing, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I peeked behind the clock, and the space was too deep, stretching infinitely. Shadows moved inside, impossibly long, scraping along walls that shouldn't exist. Something pressed against the glass of the clock's face from inside, thin hands with elongated fingers, leaving faint smears of black dust across the numbers. I slept poorly. Each dream was the same. The hands moving backward, scraping my skin, dragging hours from my body, while the whispers laughed faintly. By morning, the floor beneath the clock was warped, twisted like soft clay, bending downward as if the room itself were inhaling, drawing me toward the wall. I measured the time on my phone. 5 minutes had passed, though it felt like 3 hours. My reflection in the window looked wrong, stretched, watching me through the glass. The chimes began to whisper my thoughts aloud, first small, then entire sentences I hadn't spoken. I froze. It knew me in ways I didn't know myself. When I tried to smash the clock, the hammer passed through wood as though it were smoke. The pendulum swung harder, faster, marking time in a rhythm I couldn't follow. I heard scratching, like fingernails across metal, from deep inside the mechanism, each scrape forming shapes in the shadows that weren't there before. I looked up at the ceiling. Cracks formed slowly, spiderwebbing outward, twisting into faces pressing from the plaster, mouths moving silently in agreement with the chimes. The whispers became words I could feel in my bones. You are late. You are ours. You belong to the clock now. My hands shook as I touched it again. The pendulum reached out, thin and sharp, like a needle slicing time itself, catching me for a heartbeat that lasted a year. I ran to the kitchen. The clock followed not by moving, but by dragging the shadows across the walls, stretching into corners I hadn't known existed. Even the light bent toward it. My lamps flickered unnaturally, elongating my shadows, multiplying them, tilting reality slightly, as though the house were tilting toward the clock's will. When I hid under the bed, I could feel the pendulum above, dragging the seconds down through the floor, scraping my mind, carving thoughts I hadn't thought yet. It ticked my heartbeat. My pulse matched the chimes, sinking in a rhythm that felt wrong, like I was inside the mechanism itself. I tried leaving the room, but the doorway stretched like taffy, the floor curving, ceiling bending, all lined to keep me near, to keep me measured, to keep me accounted for. I looked back at the clock. The glass face had ripples, like water disturbed, and inside I saw something waiting, a figure with hollow eyes, stretching, smiling, counting me like an object. I tried to close my eyes. The ticking entered my mind, drilling, pacing, marking each thought as it passed through me, bending my perception of time and space. I realized the shadows weren't attached to anything. They were alive, moving independently, yet always toward the clock, orbiting it like planets in a universe I couldn't escape. The chimes struck again. The number wasn't any I recognized. Time had fractured. Hours folded in on themselves, spilling into seconds that crawled like insects across the walls. I stepped forward to touch the clock one last time. The hands reached out like skeletal fingers, brushing my wrist, cold, whispering, "It's time to finish what we started." I turned to run. The hallway had disappeared. The rooms multiplied and shrank, the ceiling pulsing, walls stretching impossibly high, floors folding into themselves, all marked by the rhythm of 13 chimes. I hid in the corner. My own shadow crawled up the wall, reaching for me, and the clock chimed again, echoing through the bones of the house. The hands rose from the face, twisting like living branches, reaching toward me, toward the floor, toward everything that still breathed. I felt the pull of time itself dragging me, seconds bending over me like water, whispering, wrapping me in rhythm, marking me as its own. By dawn, the clock stood silent, face unbroken, pendulum still, yet I knew it had learned every motion I made, every thought I harbored, every beat of my heart. I haven't slept since. Every tick I hear is from it, counting me, following me, stretching the world around me, waiting for the moment I forget I ever belonged to time. The neighbor who isn't reflected in my window. The first time I noticed the man in the hallway, he was standing perfectly still, staring at my apartment door, as if waiting for me to finally acknowledge him. I stepped toward the peephole, curious, but his figure didn't distort like normal. Instead, the fisheye lens stretched around him, swallowing his outline entirely. When I blinked, his head was tilted directly toward me, though he hadn't moved. I felt certain he somehow knew I was watching through the door. Later that night, I saw his shadow under my door, stretched impossibly long, reaching the far wall like it was searching for a way inside. I opened the door quickly, trying to catch him. The hallway was empty, lights flickering faintly, humming like distant voices trapped behind the walls. I walked to the elevator. Its button glowed faintly, but the doors opened before I touched anything, as if expecting my arrival. Inside, the mirrored wall was smudged with fingerprints that didn't match mine, arranged in patterns resembling symbols I couldn't recognize. As the doors closed, his reflection appeared behind me, though the elevator was empty. His eyes glowed faintly, watching me breathe. I turned. Nothing, but the reflection lingered an extra heartbeat before disappearing. My chest tightened, sensing something deeply wrong. When I reached my floor, the hallway stretched a little longer than before, angles bending in places I knew were straight yesterday. My apartment door was slightly open. I never leave it like that. The air inside smelled faintly of dust and cold metal. The lights flickered on before I touched the switch. Shadows shifted along the floor, moving toward the kitchen slowly, curious, alive somehow. Across the room, the window's glass rippled subtly, like someone had pressed their face against it from inside the reflection. When I approached, the city outside looked normal, but my reflection wasn't alone. The neighbor stood behind my mirrored self, motionless. I swallowed hard, unable to breathe for a moment, watching his shadow stretch to touch mine inside the glass. It felt intentional, invasive. My reflection blinked out of sync by half a second, pupils dilating too wide, like something else had climbed into its thoughts. The window darkened slowly, as though night had fallen only behind the glass. His shoulders straightened, almost proud, waiting for me to speak. The radiator moaned loudly, heat rising in waves that warped the air. Shadows clung to the corners, trembling like frightened animals. Behind me, footsteps creaked deliberately across the floorboards, evenly spaced, measured, though every light remained still and untouched. I turned again, empty room, but the air shimmered faintly, suggesting something just stepped back into a place I couldn't perceive. The window brightened suddenly. The city outside looked wrong angles too steep, buildings leaning unnaturally, colors muted like an unfinished painting. The neighbor inside the reflection leaned closer, though his actual body wasn't in my apartment. His hands pressed against the glass eagerly. I felt my breath sync with the tapping he made from the wrong side, each tap aligning with my pulse, stealing a rhythm that wasn't his. My reflection smiled without permission, a slow curl of lips I didn't command. Its eyes shifted slightly, tracking something above my head. I glanced upward. The ceiling rippled faintly, plaster bending like soft skin touched from the other side, pressing downward toward me. Wind surged through the closed window. Cold fingers brushed my neck, unmistakably intentional, drifting toward my jaw with surgical curiosity. The neighbor's reflection lifted a hand, mirroring the air's touch. Its fingers stretched longer than human, too many joints bending smoothly. The room darkened. My reflection stepped away from the glass, while I remained still, leaving me empty inside the mirror for a heartbeat. A faint whisper curled behind my ear, the same tone I'd heard through the peephole. "You finally noticed." That's how it begins. The window brightened again. My reflection slowly returned, but its eyes now mirrored the neighbor's, dark, hollow, patient. I stepped backward. The reflection remained still, refusing to follow, watching me with a hunger that didn't belong to my face. As the lights flickered once more, the neighbor's real footsteps finally echoed outside my door, and I realized the reflection hadn't been him at all. The library that reads you back. Welcome to Halfway Dark. The library wasn't on any map, but I found it behind a stairwell I'd never noticed before. The doorway pulsed faintly, like it was alive. Inside, shelves stretched impossibly high. Books stacked themselves in patterns I couldn't comprehend, some floating slightly above the floor. A book fell. Its spine cracked softly, revealing pages with my handwriting, stories I hadn't written, events I hadn't lived. I opened it. The words moved under my gaze, shifting tense in perspective, predicting thoughts I hadn't yet had. The librarian appeared, a tall figure in shadow, features blurred, watching without moving, silently cataloging me. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust, but also smoke and something metallic I couldn't place. A chair shifted toward me, slow, deliberate, inviting me to sit. I resisted. Books whispered when I passed. Names, locations, phrases I vaguely recognized, some comforting, some unnerving. A mirror on a shelf reflected the room, but my reflection held dozens of tiny versions of me, reading pages I hadn't touched. I tried to leave. The stairwell had vanished. The library expanded behind me like a living maze. The floors creaked, but no weight touched them. Shadows of unseen figures moved independently of the light. A book floated toward me, opening to a page depicting my last dream in precise detail. I reached out. The pages felt like silk and skin at once, impossible texture, alive under my fingers. A whisper curled around my ear. "Do you remember this?" I turned. No one. Yet the books rustled, shifting closer as if eavesdropping. Shelves bent toward me, creating corridors of warped light and shadow, each passage leading to another version of myself. The air grew colder. Pages flipped themselves, words forming prophecies I didn't want to understand. I stepped back. A chair rose slowly from the floor, tilting toward me, forming a throne of shadows and paper. A faint knocking echoed from the ceiling. Each knock produced faint memories I hadn't lived yet. I tried to call for help. My voice returned distorted, layered, overlapping with echoes of myself from different timelines. A staircase spiraled from a floating shelf. I climbed. Books shifted beneath my feet like living tiles. The librarian's shadow appeared at the top, its arm extended, pointing toward a single book glowing faintly on a pedestal. I approached. The book showed my life, rewritten with subtle changes I hadn't made, choices I hadn't taken, conversations I hadn't had. A whisper repeated in sync with my heartbeat. "We are learning from you." I tried to shut the book. It resisted, opening to pages showing a future I hadn't dared imagine. The walls of the library pulsed, breathing in and out, like the building itself was alive and aware. I felt dozens of eyes, none human, scanning my movements, cataloging my thoughts. The stairwell reappeared suddenly. I ran, but the library stretched endlessly behind me, always one step behind. I turned to look back. The librarian was gone, but all the books trembled as if sighing in relief. I reached the stairwell. The library doors closed. Outside, the world looked normal, but I felt cataloged, marked, forever remembered. A whisper lingered in my mind. "We'll be waiting when you forget." The subway that swallowed time. Welcome to Halfway Dark. The subway doors closed behind me, though I hadn't pressed a button. The platform outside stretched impossibly, lit by flickering lights I'd never seen before. The train shook as if exhaling, a low rumble vibrating through the metal beneath my feet, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to step forward. The doors resisted and opened slowly, revealing empty cars that seemed too long for reality. Inside, seats shifted subtly, bending like liquid when no one was near, rearranging themselves into patterns I couldn't recognize. A shadow passed over me, quick, impossible, moving against the lights, and I felt it was watching rather than hiding. The advertisements along the walls shifted, showing events I didn't recognize, and faces that mirrored my own expression of disbelief. A soft whisper echoed from the ceiling. "Every stop is already behind you." I blinked. The subway map twisted, routes bending back into themselves, looping in ways that made no sense geometrically. The train jerked. Windows reflected empty tunnels that weren't there, extending into infinite darkness. I tried to call someone. My phone displayed static, numbers replaced with symbols I couldn't interpret. The doors slid open mid-journey. Outside, platforms stretched impossibly, populated by dozens of people with familiar faces, none of whom recognized me. I stepped off. The floor beneath me seemed solid, but shivered slightly, like water reacting to weight. A figure approached, limping unnaturally, eyes hollow yet unnervingly familiar. Its mouth moved, whispering something I almost understood. I ran, but every corridor led back to the same platform. lights flickering to reveal subtle changes I couldn't track. Seats along the platform began to rise, folding like origami, casting shadows that formed fleeting letters on the walls. A train appeared in the distance, not mine, but its headlights reflected in mirrors I hadn't noticed before. The station pulsed. Steps I took echoed before I made them, as if the sound of my motion traveled ahead of me. The shadow returned, now stretching along the ceiling like ink, distorting in impossible ways, crawling toward me. I reached for a railing. It twisted under my grip, warm and cold at once, like metal fused with something alive. The advertisements changed again. Each now displayed versions of me performing mundane tasks I hadn't done yet, with subtle differences in posture. I tried to open a door. My hand passed through it. Solid surfaces no longer obeyed physics. A child ran past, laughing silently, wearing my face from 10 years ago. It paused briefly, staring at me knowingly, then vanished. The whispering returned, layered voices repeating fragments of conversations I hadn't had yet, some intimate, some terrifyingly mundane. The train lights flickered. Every reflection in the glass now held dozens of my faces, each one blinking independently. I tried to run down a stairwell. Steps stretched downward infinitely, yet the exit seemed closer every time I turned. I realized I was being cataloged. Every movement, thought, breath recorded by the station itself. A sudden gust of air, impossible underground, carried a faint smell of wet stone and decay, curling around my legs. The shadow formed a hand, reaching toward me, stretching, retracting, as if testing the rules of space itself. I stopped. The echoes of my own voice now argued with me, repeating words I hadn't yet spoken. The train's horn sounded, a single note that resonated deep in my chest, vibrating in sync with my heartbeat. I stepped back. The platform flickered between reality and impossibility, walls bending, ceilings stretching, lights splitting into prisms. The whispering became coherent for a second. You cannot leave. Not yet, not ever. I ran toward the far end. The doors opened automatically. I stumbled in. The lights went out. When they returned, the platform behind me was gone. Only the endless, impossible tracks remained, and I realized time itself had been swallowed. The apartment that breathes at night. Welcome to halfway dark. The walls shifted slightly while I slept. A faint exhale echoed from the vents, like the apartment itself was breathing. I woke. The air was heavy, damp, smelling faintly of soil and iron. My bed sagged in places I hadn't touched. The floorboards creaked, not under weight, but in rhythm with my heartbeat. I froze. The apartment was alive. A shadow slithered across the ceiling, stretching unnaturally. I tried to blink it away. It didn't vanish. The lights flickered. One bulb hummed like a distant voice calling my name. The mirror in the hallway reflected me, and a second figure, impossibly thin, standing just behind my shoulder. I spun. Nothing, but the feeling remained. Something was exhaling into the room, shaping the air around me. I sat on the couch. The cushions shifted slightly, as if inhaling when I sat and exhaling when I moved. The fridge door opened. Cold air rushed out like lungs, carrying whispers I couldn't comprehend. I reached for the handle. The whispers became laughter, soft and brittle, crawling under my skin. The walls pulsed faintly. Each beat matched my own heartbeat, then doubled it, then slowed again. I tried to leave. The apartment doors resisted, as if they were connected to something alive behind the walls. The kitchen floor rippled like water. My reflection in the window moved independently, eyes wide with recognition. A painting leaned forward slightly, tilting its frame toward me, showing a scene I didn't recognize, but somehow felt I had lived. I gasped. The ceiling warped, forming shapes of faces and limbs I couldn't place. The air grew colder. My breath fogged, but it rose faster than normal, swirling into patterns. I pressed my ear to the walls. A faint heartbeat answered mine, but not perfectly. It skipped, stuttered, paused. The couch cushions heaved once more. A soft sigh echoed from beneath them. I stepped to the balcony. The railing moved slightly, like a chest rising and falling with a breath. I leaned against it. The metal was warm, pulsing faintly like veins beneath skin. The curtains fluttered. No wind. The shadows stretched toward me, reaching, patient. I turned back inside. The living room floor rippled again, forming shallow depressions like lungs expanding. The mirror reflected me, and dozens of versions of me, each inhaling and exhaling at different paces. A soft voice whispered, "We've been waiting for you to notice." I ran to the bedroom. The bed sank slightly as I approached, as if inhaling my presence. The lights flickered violently. Shadows moved independently of objects. I tried to scream. My voice bounced off the walls and returned as dozens of whispers. The air pressed against my chest, heavy and hot, then cold, as if the apartment were breathing me instead. I realized the apartment had always been alive. Every creak, every pulse, every draft, it had been waiting. I sat on the floor, chest tight, breathing with it, or it with me, no longer sure who was alive. The night passed slowly. The apartment exhaled one last time, settling, and I fell asleep, exhausted. When I woke, everything looked normal, but I could feel it. The apartment was still breathing, still waiting. The elevator that remembers everyone who uses it. Welcome to Halfway Dark. The elevator dinged. I hadn't called it, but the doors slid open. The lights flickered, and the panel displayed a single button, my apartment number. I stepped in. The smell was familiar, antiseptic mixed with wet concrete, though I had never been alone here before. The doors closed. The panel now listed dozens of buttons, some labeled with names I didn't recognize. One blinked. Mine. A whisper echoed from the corners of the elevator. "We know you." I pressed my floor. The elevator didn't move. Instead, it hummed. I watched the numbers above blink in random sequences, none of them logical. The walls shifted subtly. Reflections of people I had never met appeared for a second, then vanished. A handprint appeared on the glass. Not mine. Too small, too pale, impossibly still. I pressed the alarm. Nothing happened. The buttons lit in a sequence. My face, smiling. I hadn't moved, yet it mirrored me perfectly. The air thickened. Breathing became difficult. My chest tightened, and I felt someone pressing behind me, though no one was there. The elevator jolted, numbers spinning, stopping briefly on a button labeled Tomorrow. A figure appeared in the mirrored walls, staring silently, wearing my exact clothes, frozen mid-step. The whisper grew. "Do you remember everyone?" I shivered. I hadn't, but somehow I felt memories flooding me. People I had met in passing, forgotten faces, names I didn't know I knew. The floor indicator skipped wildly. I realized the elevator wasn't taking me anywhere. It was cataloging me. A hand appeared on my shoulder. I spun. Empty. The air shimmered. The lights dimmed. Shadows moved independently, forming faces of people I'd once hurt, laughed at, or ignored. I pressed random buttons. The elevator stuttered, then a voice, impossibly deep, said, "You cannot leave until you remember us all." My stomach sank. I tried to step out, but the doors had vanished, replaced by a continuous wall of reflections. The mirrors shifted. Each reflection was me, older, younger, smiling, terrified, laughing, all at once. I realized the elevator kept track of everyone who entered it, storing pieces of their lives in some impossible archive. The hum became a chant, unintelligible but compelling, pulling memories I didn't know I had. I blinked. Each button pressed rewrote my perception of past events, shifting my history like clay in the hands of a sculptor. Faces appeared in the corners, whispering names I didn't know I knew. The elevator jolted downward, or was it upward? Gravity felt wrong, bending as if the shaft didn't exist. I reached for the panel. My hands passed through it. The buttons existed, but not physically. A shadow pressed itself against the back wall, tall, impossibly thin. It mimicked me in every movement. I tried to speak. My voice returned distorted, echoing dozens of times in different tones, each one unfamiliar. The floor indicator blinked rapidly. Your turn to remember. I realized I wasn't being transported. I was being studied. My reactions, my memories, my fear, cataloged. The walls shifted again. Faces smiled at me in the reflections, whispering forgotten secrets, unknown truths. I stumbled back. The panel blinked off. The elevator hummed silently, pulsing like a living heartbeat. Then the doors slid open. The hallway looked normal, familiar, yet I could feel the memories lingering, watching, waiting. I stepped out. The elevator was gone. Only a faint hum remained, deep in the building, as if waiting for the next person. The room that remembers your future. Welcome to Halfway Dark. A door appeared in my apartment that I had never seen before. The frame was ordinary, but the air around it hummed faintly, like it knew I was watching. I pushed it open. The room inside was empty, pristine, yet smelled faintly of smoke and rain, and the faint whisper of voices I hadn't heard yet. The furniture was arranged as if it had been waiting. A chair faced a wall I didn't recognize. A table had a single notebook, pages blank but vibrating slightly. I reached for the notebook. Words appeared as I watched. My name, the exact date, a task I hadn't performed yet, written in a hand I didn't recognize. A faint tapping echoed. I turned, expecting someone, but the room was empty. My own footsteps sounded heavier, but the shadows didn't match my movements. I blinked. The table now held a cup of coffee I hadn't poured. Steam rose in letters spelling, "You will see this soon." The window showed the street below, but the cars moved backward. Pedestrians walking in reverse, their faces distorted, as if replaying moments from a future I hadn't lived yet. A mirror reflected my face, slightly older, eyes hollow, lips trembling. I hadn't moved, but it smiled before I did. I stepped closer. My reflection turned away, gesturing toward a corner I didn't know existed. A faint doorframe shimmered there, pulsing like a heartbeat. The room hummed. Objects moved imperceptibly. I tried to step forward, but the floor shifted beneath me, like gravity itself was rewriting the rules. A notebook page flipped. It described my last conversation with a friend I hadn't called in years. Words I hadn't spoken yet, tone of voice and pauses exact. I heard whispers, promises of events that hadn't occurred, warnings of choices I hadn't made. The voice sounded uncannily like me. I touched the chair. The moment I did, the air warped. I felt my own heartbeat from a future moment, skipping, racing, echoing. The notebook now showed sketches, layouts of rooms I would enter in days I hadn't lived yet. Furniture shifted, doors that didn't exist in my current apartment. I tried to leave. The door closed behind me. I was still in the room, yet somehow outside at the same time, aware of both spaces at once. The window flickered. I saw myself outside, walking past the building I currently occupied, waving at me. I didn't know which me to respond to. A chair fell over. No one touched it. The sound echoed as if replaying from a memory I hadn't yet experienced. I touched the notebook again. Words changed. You will leave through the door. You will try to tell someone. You will fail. The shadows in the room thickened. Shapes moved independently of the light, stretching and bending toward corners that shouldn't exist. I realized the floor wasn't stable. It shifted beneath me. tilting like liquid, and I stumbled into a wall that became soft, malleable, yielding my weight but reshaping itself. The notebook's pages began to tear themselves, revealing a small key, tiny and cold, etched with symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively understood. I picked up the key. It fit into a drawer that hadn't been there a second ago. Inside, a photo of me sleeping, taken from an angle impossible to achieve, dated tomorrow. The room pulsed. The walls contracted and expanded slowly, almost imperceptibly, each cycle revealing faint images of my future, some joyful, some terrifying. I pressed my hands against the walls. They were warm, like skin. A pulse ran through them, synchronized to my heartbeat, and then faster, to a rhythm I had yet to experience. I shouted, but the sound dissolved in the warped geometry. It felt as if the air itself swallowed my voice, storing it for a future echo. I noticed the notebook again. It showed a paragraph that hadn't existed before. You have read this. You will remember it differently tomorrow. I tried to step backward, but the floor guided me forward. Each movement felt pre-written, like my body was following instructions I hadn't yet received. The shadows now moved in patterns, forming letters I couldn't decipher, and shapes of people I didn't know but felt familiar. I realized this room had been waiting for me, recording moments before they happened, anticipating choices I hadn't made, building a memory of my future. The air thickened. Breathing became a task, each inhale reminding me that the room knew more than I ever could. I tried one last time to open the door. It resisted. My hands trembled. Then, without warning, it swung open, revealing a hallway I recognized but wasn't real. I stepped through. The notebook, the chair, the shifting floor, all gone. Only a faint hum remained, whispering promises I didn't yet understand. The hallway stretched endlessly, but I knew it was temporary. The room would return, sooner or later, remembering me again, anticipating the life I had yet to live. The street that loops on itself. Welcome to Halfway Dark. I left my apartment for a quick walk, thinking it would clear my head. 2 blocks later, I stopped. My front door was staring back at me. I blinked. The city was familiar, but wrong. Street signs bent at impossible angles, sidewalks folded under themselves, and streetlights cast shadows that shouldn't exist. A man passed me, smiling. His face was mine. I stumbled back. He waved, still smiling. The next moment, he was gone. I turned down another street, trying to escape the sensation of déjà vu. The buildings stretched into impossible lengths, corners bending at angles my mind refused to comprehend. Every turn I took brought me back to my own front door. The doormat looked the same, the welcome mat letters slightly askew, mocking me. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain, but no storm had passed. The smell seemed to follow me, thickening with each step. A child ran past, laughing. Her face was mine at 8 years old, smiling exactly the way I used to. She vanished around a corner that shouldn't exist. I tried to call someone. My phone displayed the correct time, but the map spun wildly, showing the street bending in impossible loops. Windows on nearby buildings reflected angles that didn't exist in reality. I swore I saw myself leaning out of one, watching me walk, mouthing words I couldn't hear. The streetlights flickered, and I realized the shadows didn't match my movements. They moved ahead of me, waiting for something I couldn't name. A dog barked in the distance. It was familiar, but every bark echoed like 10 dogs, overlapping perfectly, creating a rhythm I couldn't understand. I passed a cafe I'd never seen. Through the window, everyone inside wore my face, all of them smiling in a way that felt too knowing. I tried to leave, running, but every street I chose curved impossibly back to my building. Even the sky seemed to bend, stretching like taffy above me. The mailbox near my front door shifted slightly each time I blinked. I swear it was inches taller than before, tilting toward me like a warning. The shadows deepened. Shapes crawled across the pavement, subtle, impossible, as if the universe was unspooling, and I was caught in the fray. I ducked into an alley. For a moment, I felt safe. Then the alley led me to a street I recognized from my childhood, except the houses were warped, twisted, impossibly tall. A stranger smiled at me. His eyes reflected the buildings behind me, bending and looping endlessly. I turned. The street was gone, replaced by another loop, the same yet not the same. The wind whispered words I didn't understand, or maybe I did, but my mind refused to grasp them. My name was repeated, stretched across the air. I stopped. My legs burned. The street looked normal. Too normal. Then I realized my door was open. I had never left. I stepped inside. The apartment was quiet, but the calendar on the wall flipped rapidly, days looping back, erasing themselves, rewriting time in front of my eyes. I ran to the window. Outside, the street curved endlessly, repeating the same impossible geometry, no end in sight. A dozen versions of me walked the loops, all smiling. I fell to my knees. Reality was fractured. Each blink rearranged the city subtly, like it was alive, watching, toying with me. I shouted, but my voice echoed back distorted, slower, each echo slightly off, each repetition another version of myself screaming. The street twisted further, impossibly. I realized I had never been here before, but had always been here, trapped in loops of moments I couldn't escape. I tried to step forward. My feet moved, but the world didn't. The street stretched and pulled, bending space around me, dragging time like a rope I couldn't hold. The air shimmered. Buildings flickered like old photographs. Streetlights bent toward me, stretching longer than physics allowed. A child with my face ran past again, pointing at me, laughing silently. I screamed, but sound dissolved into the warped geometry of the street. I realized something horrifying. The street wasn't a place. It was alive, watching, folding reality around my own footsteps. I blinked. My front door was finally gone. Nothing looked familiar. Nothing existed as it should. The street whispered. I couldn't hear words, only understanding. You will keep walking. You will keep looping. You are part of it now. The apartment that eats time. I woke up on a Thursday that felt like a Tuesday. The walls had shifted just enough to make the hallway seem longer, like time itself was stretching beneath my feet. The coffee table was moved a fraction to the left. It was subtle, but the exact spot I remembered yesterday was gone, swallowed by some impossible fraction of space. The clock on the wall ticked normally, but when I glanced again, the hands had advanced 20 minutes in what felt like 5. My heart lurched. I tried to remember when I last checked the mail. My memory was a blur, like someone had smudged the past with wet fingers. The apartment smelled faintly metallic, like rain on concrete, but the windows were closed and no storm existed. Something about the air was aware of me. My reflection in the bathroom mirror hesitated, then moved independently, tilting its head before I did, smiling like it was in on a secret I couldn't grasp. I sat at the edge of my bed, counting seconds. Something told me that time here wasn't mine, that each blink was being measured and rearranged. The bookshelf leaned slightly to the right, imperceptibly at first, but I swear one of the books had shifted by its own weight. I stepped into the kitchen. The fridge hummed normally, but the milk carton was labeled in a hand I didn't recognize, with today's date misspelled. A buzzing sound rose from the toaster. It wasn't plugged in. When I approached, it stopped. Silence pressed against my ears, heavy and patient. I noticed the light switch. I hadn't touched it, but the kitchen was brighter, almost painfully so, and shadows stretched wrong, folding across the floor like liquid. The rug in the living room looked familiar but wrong. Patterns repeated where they never had. One corner seemed to pulse, like the weave itself was breathing. I poured a cup of coffee, black. The liquid trembled unnaturally, then settled into a shape resembling my own face, staring back at me silently. The hallway door shifted slightly as I walked past. I spun. Nothing. But when I blinked, it was 2 steps closer, as if time itself had moved the walls. I sat back down, chest tight. The calendar on the wall showed Thursday, but my phone said Wednesday. My brain couldn't reconcile the discrepancy. A sound came from the bedroom, the floorboards creaking in a rhythm that mimicked my heartbeat. I froze, listening. Something was walking in sync with me. I touched the wall. Cold, solid, then warm, then cold again. Each pulse of temperature felt like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The coffee table had shifted again. I didn't remember moving it, but I was sure it had been farther to the left a moment ago. A shadow crossed the living room. It wasn't mine. It moved against the angle of the light, and I swore it lingered after I blinked. I checked the hallway mirror. It reflected me perfectly, except for the slight twitch of my eyes, a movement I hadn't made. The apartment smelled like burnt toast now, but the toaster was empty. I gagged, trying to understand what I was breathing. What was in this air? I stepped toward the window. The city outside looked normal, except the streets looped strangely, as if the buildings had stretched while I slept. My phone buzzed. A notification. You've already seen this. I hadn't. I stared at the screen, but it was blank, the message lingering in my mind. The floor vibrated slightly, then stopped. I could feel it under my feet, like the apartment itself was testing my balance, my patience, my sanity. I opened the fridge again. Milk was replaced by a small photograph of myself, sleeping, taken from an angle I didn't recognize. I blinked. The photo was gone. A different photograph now showed me pouring coffee, though I hadn't moved yet. The clock advanced another 20 minutes in what felt like 5. I shouted, but my voice sounded wrong, distant, like someone else had stolen it. The rug pulsed again. Patterns seemed to shift beneath me. I stepped on it. The moment I touched it, the hallway door slammed shut. I heard laughter, faint, not human, not animal, somewhere between the apartment and my own mind. I froze, clutching the coffee cup. I realized I could no longer trust my memory. Each object, each tick of the clock, was rearranged without my consent, as though the apartment were alive and rewriting me. The shadow in the living room stretched, reaching toward me. I didn't run. I couldn't. My body felt glued to the warped floor. The apartment hummed. Warm, alive, patient. I whispered, "What do you want from me?" The silence answered, "Nothing. Everything." I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke, the calendar flipped back a day, the coffee cup was gone, and the apartment was still hungry. Tonight, if your walls shift, if your floors breathe, if your memories don't match your reflection, maybe you're inside an apartment that eats time too.